They opened the door at midnight and found someone waiting. Not a neighbor, not a traveler they recognized, just a stranger standing quietly in the snow, as if he had been expected all along, as if the door had been opened precisely for him. The family stood frozen for a moment, the cold air rushing in, the candles flickering, the final seconds of the old year slipping away. And then, without a word, they stepped aside and welcomed him in. By morning he was gone, vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared. But the house felt different, lighter, warmer, as if something heavy had been carried away in the night and something bright had been left in its place. This is the legend of the door that opened at midnight, one of the most beautiful and mysterious New Year's tales from old Europe. It speaks of a night when tradition and mystery converged, when a simple act of hospitality became something more, when the threshold between one year and the next became a threshold between the ordinary and the extraordinary. It is a story about doors, both literal and metaphorical, about what we let go and what we invite in, about the courage it takes to open ourselves to the unknown and the blessings that sometimes arrive when we do. In the old villages of medieval Europe, New Year's Eve was not the loud, celebratory affair we know today. There were no fireworks, no crowded streets, no countdowns broadcast to millions. Instead, it was a night of quiet transition, of reflection and ritual, of private ceremonies carried out in individual homes with reverence and hope. The turning of the year was understood as a sacred moment, a hinge point in time when the past released its grip and the future had not yet taken hold. A moment of possibility, a moment of vulnerability, a moment when the veil between what was and what might be grew thin enough to see through, if you knew how to look. And there were rituals, ways of marking the passage, of honoring the year that had been and welcoming the year to come. Some were practical, rooted in the rhythms of agricultural life and the hope for good harvests. Others were more mystical, touching on beliefs that predated Christianity and had been woven into the fabric of rural life so thoroughly that no one quite remembered where they came from. They were simply what you did, what your parents had done, what their parents had done. Traditions passed down not because anyone could explain their origin, but because they felt right, because they connected the living to the dead, because they provided structure and meaning in a world that often seemed chaotic and unpredictable. One of the most widespread of these traditions was the opening of doors at midnight. As the old year gave way to the new, doors throughout the village would swing open, regardless of the weather, regardless of the cold. Sometimes it was the front door only. Sometimes every door in the house, from front to back, creating a clear path to the dwelling. The purpose varied depending on who you asked. Some said it was to let the old year leave, to provide an exit for all the sorrow and hardship and disappointment that had accumulated over the previous 12 months. Others said it was to invite the new year in, to create an opening through which blessings and good fortune could enter. Most believed it was both, that you had to release the past before you could receive the future. That doors worked in two directions, allowing both departure and arrival. The practical risks were real. Opening your door in the middle of winter meant letting precious heat escape. It meant exposing your home to wind and snow and the bitter cold that could kill. But the spiritual necessity was understood to be greater. Better to lose warmth temporarily than to trap the old year inside, where it might spoil and corrupt the new one. Better to shiver for a few moments than to close yourself off from whatever blessings the universe might send. The door was opened, always, without question. It was what you did on New Year's Eve if you wanted the coming year to be different from the one that had passed. But this story, this particular legend, adds something more to the tradition. It asks, what if, when you opened your door at midnight, something answered? What if the threshold you created was not just symbolic, but actual, not just spiritual, but physical? What if the new year did not arrive as an abstract concept, but as a living presence, standing in the snow, waiting to be welcomed? And what if your response to that presence, your willingness to extend hospitality to the unknown, determined the character of all the months to come? The village where this story takes place could have been any of 1,000 villages scattered across medieval Europe. Small, remote, self-contained. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where your family's history stretched back generations, where the rhythms of life remained largely unchanged year after year. It was not a wealthy place. The homes were modest. The people worked hard and worried often. But there was something steady about it, something enduring. The church stood at the center, its bell marking the hours. The fields surrounded the cluster of houses, waiting patient and frozen for spring. The forest pressed close, dark and deep, both threat and provider. On this particular New Year's Eve, the village was quiet. A heavy snow had fallen in the afternoon, muffling sound, transforming familiar paths into soft white channels between homes. By evening, the temperature had dropped sharply, the kind of cold that made your lungs ache and your fingers go numb within minutes. People stayed inside, gathered around their hearths, speaking in low voices as the hours crawled toward midnight. There was a tension in the air, not unpleasant but palpable, the sense of something ending and something beginning. The awareness that time was moving, relentless and unstoppable, carrying them all from what had been into what would be. In one cottage near the edge of the village lived a man named Jacob, his wife Marta, and their 2 children. They were ordinary in every way. Not wealthy, not poor, not especially blessed, not especially cursed. They worked their small plot of land, attended church, helped neighbors when help was needed, and asked for help when they needed it themselves. The year that was ending had been difficult, but not catastrophic. A poor harvest, but not total failure. An illness that had swept through the household, but everyone had survived. Deaths in the village, but not in their immediate family. The kind of year that left you grateful to have endured, while also eager to leave it behind. As midnight approached, Jacob and Marta prepared for the traditional opening of the door. They had done this every year since their marriage, as their parents had done before them, as everyone in the village did. It was simply part of how New Year's Eve unfolded. The children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 6, were still awake despite the late hour, their faces bright with the special excitement of being allowed to stay up past their usual bedtime. They understood, in the vague way children understand adult rituals, that something important was about to happen. Marta had set out a small offering on the table near the door, bread and salt and a cup of water. Another tradition, though this one was less universal, practiced in some households, but not all. The bread represented sustenance. The salt represented preservation and protection. The water represented cleansing and renewal. Together, they formed a welcome for whatever the new year might bring, a gesture of hospitality extended before any guest had arrived. Jacob stood by the door as the church bell began to toll midnight, its sound carrying through the cold air, clear and solemn. 1, 2, 3. The family counted silently, feeling each stroke marked another second of the old year's passing. 7, 8, 9. Jacob's hand rested on the latch. 10, 11. And then, as the 12th stroke rang out, he pulled the door open. The cold rushed in like water through a broken dam, sharp and shocking after the warmth of the cottage. The candles guttered but did not go out. Outside, the snow lay pristine and undisturbed, glowing faintly in the starlight. The village was silent except for the fading echo of the church bell and the distant sound of other doors opening, other families performing the same ritual throughout the community. Jacob stood at the threshold, looking out into the night, feeling the weight of the moment. This was the space between. The old year had ended with the final stroke of the bell. The new year had begun. But for this brief moment, neither quite held dominion. The world was suspended, waiting. He breathed in the cold air, felt it burn his lungs, and prepared to speak the traditional words that marked the opening. Words that invited the new year, that blessed the household, that asked for protection and prosperity in the months ahead. But before he could speak, he saw movement in the darkness. At first he thought it was a trick of shadow and starlight, or perhaps falling snow disturbed by wind. But no, there was someone there, a figure standing just beyond the small circle of light that spilled from the open door. A man, tall and still, wrapped in a dark cloak, his face obscured by shadow. Not approaching, not retreating, simply standing, waiting. Jacob felt his wife's hand on his shoulder, felt her tense with surprise or fear or both. The children pressed close behind them, peering around their parents to see what had caused the sudden silence. For a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The stranger stood in the snow. The family stood in the doorway. The moment stretched and held. It was not entirely unusual for travelers to pass through the village, even in winter, though it was rare for them to be out so late, especially on New Year's Eve. But the timing of this appearance, The fact that this person had arrived at precisely midnight, at precisely the moment when the door was opened, created a strangeness that mere coincidence could not quite explain. It felt intentional, fated, as if the stranger had been waiting for the door to open, had known it would open, had come specifically to be here in this moment. Jacob's mind raced through possibilities. A neighbor playing some kind of joke, though that seemed unlikely given the solemnity with which everyone treated this night. A lost traveler genuinely seeking shelter, though how he had found his way here in darkness was puzzling. A beggar or wanderer, though most such people knew better than to travel on New Year's Eve. Was something else, something the old stories spoke of, something that belonged to that category of experiences that people whispered about, but rarely claimed to have witnessed directly. There were tales, of course. There were always tales. Stories of mysterious strangers who appeared at thresholds on sacred nights. Some said they were angels in disguise, sent to test the hospitality of households. Others claimed they were spirits of ancestors, returning briefly to check on the living. A few spoke of darker possibilities, of creatures that could take human form, of tests that were also traps. But those darker tales were usually told as warnings about what not to do, about the dangers of refusing hospitality, of closing your door to someone in need. The core teaching was consistent. When someone appears at your door on a holy night, you welcome them. You do not question. You do not hesitate. You step aside and invite them in, because you never know who you might be entertaining. Because kindness to strangers was kindness to the divine. Because the universe was watching to see how you would respond to this test. Jacob made his decision. Or perhaps the decision had already been made by generations of tradition, by the stories he had heard all his life, by the simple understanding that on New Year's Eve, when you open your door, you do so with the willingness to accept whatever comes through it. He stepped aside. He gestured toward the warm interior of the cottage. He spoke, his voice steady despite the strangeness of the moment. "You are welcome here. Please, come inside." The stranger moved forward. Not quickly, not slowly, but with the measured pace of someone who had been confident all along that he would be welcomed. As he stepped into the circle of candlelight, the family could see him more clearly, though clarity did not bring understanding. He was tall, perhaps 40 years of age, perhaps younger, perhaps older. His face was unremarkable in its ordinariness, neither handsome nor homely, neither kind nor cruel in expression, just neutral, present. His clothes were those of a traveler, practical and worn, neither fine nor ragged. Everything about him suggested ordinariness, yet his presence carried weight, as if he occupied more space than his physical form should require. He crossed the threshold. Jacob closed the door behind him, shutting out the cold and the night and the old year that had finally, fully passed. The cottage felt suddenly warmer, the whether from the door being closed or from some other cause. No one could quite say. "Thank you," the stranger said. His voice was quiet, clear, utterly calm. "The night is cold, and I have come a long way." Marta moved into action with the automatic hospitality that was second nature to anyone raised in such communities. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the chair near the hearth. "Warm yourself. Are you hungry?" "I am," the stranger admitted, moving to the offered seat with fluid grace. He settled into the chair as if he had sat there many times before, as if the cottage and its people were familiar to him, though they had never seen him in their lives. The children watched with wide eyes as their mother laid out food. The bread and salt from the threshold offering, supplemented with cheese and dried meat and the remains of the evening's soup, reheated quickly over the fire. Not a feast, but more than adequate. The stranger ate slowly, deliberately, with quiet appreciation. Jacob poured cups of ale from the small barrel they kept for special occasions, and the adults drank together while the children finally began to grow drowsy, leaning against their mother, fighting sleep despite their exhaustion. "You travel on a strange night," Jacob said, the words half statement, half question. The stranger smiled, a small expression that did not quite reach his eyes but seemed genuine nonetheless. "Strange nights are when journeys are most necessary," he replied. "When one chapter closes and another begins, that is when we must be on the road, moving from what was toward what will be." It was an odd answer, neither evasive nor quite direct, the kind of response that seemed to mean more than its words suggested. Jacob nodded as if he understood, though he was not certain he did. Marta listened while settling the children into their sleeping alcove, tucking blankets around them, whispering the usual nighttime reassurances. Within minutes, both were asleep, exhausted by the late hour and the excitement of the stranger's arrival. The three adults sat near the hearth as the fire burned low. They spoke of small things: the winter, the village, the year that had passed. The stranger asked questions, but revealed little about himself: where he had come from, where he was going, why he traveled alone in such conditions. These remained unanswered, and somehow asking directly felt wrong, felt like a violation of some unspoken agreement. He had appeared. They had welcomed him. That was enough. The rest was mystery, and mystery had its own protocols. As the night wore on, a strange peace settled over the cottage. The kind of comfortable silence that usually only exists between people who know each other well. Yet here it was among strangers. The fire crackled softly. The wind outside had died away. Snow fell quietly past the window. Time seemed to slow, to thicken, to become less a series of moments and more a single extended present where past and future lost their distinction. Eventually, Jacob and Marta grew too tired to stay awake. The stranger insisted they rest, said he would tend the fire, said he needed little sleep and was accustomed to keeping watch through the night. They hesitated, the old warnings about inviting strangers into your home surfacing briefly in their minds. But exhaustion and the strange trust this man inspired won out. They retreated to their own bed, leaving the stranger sitting by the hearth, his face illuminated by the dying firelight, his expression distant and peaceful, as if he were listening to music no one else could hear. Marta whispered to her husband as they lay down, "Should we have left him alone in our house?" Jacob was silent for a moment, then said, "I think we had no choice. I think he was meant to be here. Who do you think he is?" "I don't know, but I'm not afraid." And it was true. Despite the strangeness of it all, despite every practical reason for caution, neither of them felt fear. Only a deep, inexplicable sense that everything was unfolding exactly as it should. They slept. What happened in those hours while the family slept, no one could say. The stranger sat by the fire. He did not move much. He kept the flames fed with wood from the neat stack beside the hearth. He seemed to be keeping vigil, though for what or why remained unclear. Sometimes he appeared to be looking at the sleeping family with an expression that might have been fondness or sadness or some complex mixture of both. Sometimes he looked toward the door, as if expecting someone else to arrive, though no one came. If the children dreamed that night, they dreamed peacefully. If Jacob and Marta woke briefly in the dark hours before dawn, they saw the reassuring glow of the fire, heard the soft sounds of someone moving gently through the room, and drifted back to sleep without alarm. The cottage felt safe, protected, as if the stranger's presence had created a barrier against all harm, a circle of peace that nothing could penetrate. In some versions of this story, the stranger is said to have moved through the house during the night, touching various objects, not disturbing anything, not taking anything, but simply laying his hands on certain items as if blessing them. The plow that leaned against the wall, the spinning wheel in the corner, the jars of stored food, the cradle where the children had slept as infants, each touch light and brief, yet somehow significant, as if he were leaving something behind with each contact, some invisible gift that would only reveal itself later. In other versions, he is said to have sat completely still all night, doing nothing but watching the fire burn, yet somehow his mere presence transformed the space, as if the house itself absorbed something from him, as if his quiet attention was a form of blessing more powerful than any action could be. The truth, as with all such stories, may have been both or neither. What matters is not the specific actions, but the nature of the encounter. A stranger arrived at the threshold moment between years. A family chose welcome over caution. A night passed in peace. And when morning came, something had changed. Jacob woke to gray dawn light seeping through the window. The fire had burned down to embers, but the cottage was still warm, warmer perhaps than it should have been given how low the flames had gotten. He lay still for a moment, remembering the events of the previous night, wondering if some of it had been dream. But no, the chair by the hearth showed signs of having been sat in. The cups from which they had drunk still sat on the table. It had been real. He rose quietly, not wanting to wake his wife or children yet. He approached the hearth and found it had been tended with skill, The embers banked perfectly to provide warmth through the remaining hours of darkness while using minimal wood. The stranger had known what he was doing. But where was the stranger? Jacob looked around the small cottage. Empty. He checked the alcove where the children slept. Just the children, breathing deeply, peaceful. The bed where he and Marta had slept. Just Marta, beginning to stir. No sign of the stranger anywhere. He went to the door and opened it carefully. The morning was bright and cold and still. Fresh snow had fallen during the night, covering the paths, creating a pristine white world. And there, clearly visible, were footprints leading from the door. Just one set, leading out into the village and then disappearing around the corner of a neighboring house. The stranger had left some time before dawn, walking out into the snow, and had not returned. Jacob stepped outside, intending to call out, to see if the man was nearby, but something stopped him. The footprints told their own story. The stranger had come. He had been welcomed. He had kept watch through the night. And now he had gone, as quietly and mysteriously as he had arrived. To pursue him felt wrong, felt like it would violate the integrity of the encounter. Some guests are meant to come and go without explanation. Some blessings are meant to be received without question. He stood in the cold morning air, looking at those solitary footprints leading away, and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude mixed with loss. Gratitude for the stranger's presence, loss at his departure, and something else, harder to name. A feeling that something significant had occurred, that the night had been more than it seemed, that his family had been given a gift whose value would only become apparent in time. Marta appeared at the door, wrapped in a shawl, her face questioning. He's gone. He's gone. Did he say goodbye? He left while we slept. She stood beside her husband, looking at the footprints, and understanding passed between them without words. They had done what was right. They had opened their door. They had welcomed a stranger. They had offered hospitality without hesitation or calculation. And now that stranger had departed, leaving them with nothing but memory and mystery and the first day of a new year that felt somehow different from any year that had come before. The change was not immediate, not obvious, not the kind of dramatic transformation that would make the skeptical suddenly believe or the faithful suddenly certain. Instead, it was subtle, a gradual shift in the household's fortune that could have been coincidence, could have been the natural variation of luck, or could have been something more. It started small. Jacob went to check on their cow, expecting to find her still producing the meager amount of milk that had characterized the past several months. Instead, she gave nearly twice as much, and the milk was richer, creamier. Just one morning, maybe a fluke. But then it continued, day after day, the cow's production remaining high and consistent in a way it had not been for over a year. Marta discovered that the preserves she had thought would barely last through winter were somehow more abundant than she remembered. Not that new jars had appeared, nothing so overtly miraculous. Just that when she carefully measured what remained and calculated how long it would last, the numbers worked out better than they should have. The food stretched further. The stores depleted more slowly. The family ate better without having any more than before. The children, who had been prone to the coughs and fevers that plagued most young ones through winter, remained healthy. Week after week passed without illness, without the anxious nights of checking feverish foreheads and praying for morning. They played and ate and grew stronger, their faces gaining color, their energy boundless in the way of children who are truly well rather than merely not sick. And Jacob himself felt different. The back pain that had troubled him for years, the legacy of too many seasons bent over crocks and too many winters working in cold and damp, had eased. Not disappeared entirely, but softened to the point where he could work a full day without the grinding ache that usually accompanied his every movement. He felt stronger, more energetic, younger somehow, though he could not have explained what that meant. But perhaps more significant than these physical changes was something less tangible. The atmosphere of the house had shifted. There had been, for many months, a heaviness that had settled over the family. Not constant unhappiness, but a kind of grinding weariness, a sense that they were enduring rather than living, surviving rather than thriving. After the stranger's visit, that heaviness lifted. Conversations came more easily. Laughter returned. Small frustrations that might once have sparked arguments now resolved quickly and gently. The family simply felt lighter, more at ease with each other and the world. Neighbors noticed. They would stop by and comment on how well the children looked, how cheerful Marta seemed, how robust Jacob appeared. They would ask, in the indirect way that people do when they sense something has changed but cannot quite name what, if anything special had happened. Jacob and Marta would exchange glances, would smile small private smiles, and would say simply that the new year had started well. They did not speak of the stranger. Something about the encounter felt private, sacred, meant to be held close rather than shared widely. But in a small village, secrets were difficult to keep. Other families began to ask directly. Had they opened their door at midnight? Had anyone appeared? And finally, Jacob told the story. Simply, without embellishment. A stranger had been standing in the snow when they opened the door. They had invited him in. They had shared food and warmth. He had kept watch through the night. By morning he was gone. The reactions varied. Some dismissed it as coincidence, a traveler who happened to be passing through at an opportune moment. Others saw significance but disagreed about what kind. Old Anna, who knew more folklore than anyone in the village, nodded knowingly and said that Jacob and Marta had entertained an angel unawares, that the new year itself had come to their threshold in human form and they had welcomed it properly, and that was why blessing followed. Father Thomas, the village priest, heard the story and gave a sermon the following Sunday about hospitality to strangers, reminding his flock of the biblical injunction to welcome the foreigner, for in doing so some had entertained angels. He did not mention Jacob and Marta by name, but everyone knew. The story became part of the village's shared narrative, one more thread in the tapestry of tales that bound the community together. And in the months that followed, other families reported their own experiences. Small blessings, unexpected fortunes, moments when doors opened and something good entered, though not always in the form of a stranger. Sometimes it was an opportunity, sometimes a reconciliation with an estranged relative, sometimes just a shift in perspective that made old problems seem more manageable. The new year had entered the village, and it had brought renewal with it. For Jacob and Marta, life continued its ordinary rhythms, but ordinary now felt different, felt blessed. They tended their small plot of land and found the soil more responsive than it had been in years. They raised their children and watched them grow healthy and strong. They helped their neighbors and were helped in turn. They lived simply, as they had always lived, but now with a deep, quiet gratitude that colored everything they did. Years later, when the children were grown and had families of their own, they would tell their children about the night their grandparents opened the door at midnight and found someone waiting. The story would change slightly with each telling, details added or forgotten, interpretations offered and debated. But the core remained constant: an open door, a welcome stranger, a blessing received. And the lesson, implicit in the telling, that hospitality matters, that kindness to the unknown brings unexpected rewards, that the new year enters through the doors we choose to open. To understand why this story resonated so deeply across generations, we must understand what doors meant in the medieval imagination. They were not merely practical barriers against weather and intruders, though they were certainly that. They were thresholds, liminal spaces, places where inside met outside, where safety met danger, where the known met the unknown. To cross a threshold was always significant. To open a door was always an act of consequence. In medieval symbolism, doors appeared everywhere. The door to the church was the gateway to sacred space. The door to your home was the boundary of your private world. The door to a castle was the first line of defense. The door to a city was the point of control and taxation. Every door marked a transition, a movement from one state to another, and therefore every door carried meaning beyond its physical function. The tradition of opening doors at midnight on New Year's Eve took this symbolism and elevated it. On this one night of all nights, the door became more than a barrier. It became an invitation, an act of faith, a declaration that the household was ready to receive whatever the new year might bring, good or ill, blessing or challenge. To open your door in the dead of winter, in the dark of midnight, was to make yourself vulnerable in a very literal way. It was to say, I trust that what comes through this threshold will be worth the risk of opening it. This trust was not naive. Medieval people understood danger intimately. They knew that strangers could bring disease, theft, violence. They knew that opening your door meant opening yourself to both help and harm. But they also understood, in a way that perhaps we have forgotten, that without risk there is no growth, that without vulnerability there is no connection, that without opening yourself to the possibility of harm, you also close yourself to the possibility of blessing. The figure of the stranger in this story operates on multiple levels. On the literal level, he is simply a traveler who needed shelter and received it. On the symbolic level, he represents the new year itself, arriving at the threshold, waiting to be welcomed, ready to bring whatever he carries. On the spiritual level, he might be an angel, a divine messenger, a test of the household's character. The beauty of the story is that it never resolves these possibilities into a single interpretation. It allows all of them to coexist, to be simultaneously true. This multiplicity of meaning is characteristic of folklore. The best stories work on many levels at once, offering different truths to different audiences at different times. A child hearing this tale might simply enjoy the mystery and excitement. A young adult might focus on the themes of hospitality and kindness. An older person might contemplate the nature of blessing and how good fortune arrives in unexpected forms. A priest might emphasize the religious dimensions, the idea of entertaining angels unawares. All of these interpretations are valid. All are contained within the story. The tradition of opening doors at New Year's was part of a broader cultural practice of marking transitions. Medieval people had rituals for birth, marriage, death, harvest, planting, and countless other occasions when life shifted from one state to another. These rituals served multiple functions. They provided structure and predictability in an unpredictable world. They created community through shared practice. They encoded wisdom about how to navigate difficult moments. And they acknowledged that there are forces in the universe larger than ourselves, forces that sometimes require our cooperation or recognition. The New Year's door opening specifically acknowledged that time itself was a mystery, that the future was unknowable, that each new year brought possibilities both terrifying and wonderful. By opening your door, you were saying, I accept this. I am ready. I will not hide from whatever comes. This was an act of courage as much as faith, an assertion of agency in the face of fate. You could not control what the new year would bring, but you could control how you received it, with an open door or a closed one, with welcome or with fear, with hospitality or with suspicion. And the story teaches that how we receive matters, that our posture toward the unknown shapes what the unknown brings us. Jacob and Marta did not have to welcome the stranger. They could have closed the door, could have cited the cold or the late hour or simple prudence. No one would have blamed them, but they chose welcome, and that choice changed everything. Not because it magically transformed their circumstances, but because it opened them to possibilities that a closed door would have forever excluded. This is perhaps the deepest wisdom of the story, that blessing often comes disguised as inconvenience. That what we think we cannot afford to do might be exactly what we most need to do. That generosity, even when it costs us something real, returns to us multiplied in ways we cannot predict. The stranger did not announce himself as a blessing. He appeared as a problem, a complication, someone who needed something from a family that had little to spare. But Jacob and Marta saw past the immediate inconvenience to the deeper truth, that we are all strangers to each other until we choose connection, that hospitality is not just kindness to others, but kindness to ourselves, that in welcoming the unknown, we welcome our own future. There is also something profound in the fact that the stranger left no clear explanation of who he was or why he had come. He did not announce himself as an angel or a test or a personification of the new year. He simply was. He appeared, was welcomed, stayed the night, and departed. And in that simplicity lies a truth about how grace often works in our lives. It does not arrive with fanfare or clear labels. It comes quietly, stays briefly, and leaves us to figure out what happened long after it has gone. The villagers who heard Jacob's story tried to make sense of it, tried to fit it into categories they understood. Angel, spirit, symbol. But the story resists these neat categorizations. It remains mysterious, and that mystery is part of its power. It suggests that the universe contains more than we can explain, that our categories are too small to hold reality, that we must learn to live with uncertainty and find meaning even in what we cannot fully understand. This comfort with mystery is something we have largely lost in the modern world. We want explanations. We want to know how things work and why they happen. We are uncomfortable with stories that do not resolve clearly, with experiences that remain ambiguous. But medieval people, living in a world that was in many ways more mysterious and dangerous than ours, had made peace with not knowing. They told stories that celebrated mystery rather than explaining it away. They understood that some truths are too large for words, some experiences too deep for analysis. The door that opened at midnight remains open in our imagination. It invites us to consider our own thresholds, our own moments of transition, our own opportunities to welcome the unknown. We all face new years, literal and metaphorical. Moments when the old gives way to the new, when we must decide whether to greet change with fear or with hope, with closed doors or with open ones. And so the story ends, as it must, with more questions than answers. Who was the stranger? Where did he come from? Where did he go? Why did he appear at that particular door on that particular night? The story does not tell us. Perhaps because those are not the right questions. Perhaps the right questions are these. What doors have I closed that should be open? What strangers have I turned away? What blessings have I refused because they came in unexpected forms? Jacob and Martha grew old together in their cottage, surrounded eventually by grandchildren and great-grandchildren who heard the story of the midnight stranger told and retold until it became part of their own identity, part of how they understood themselves and their place in the world. The cottage itself eventually crumbled, as all physical structures must, reclaimed by time and weather. The village changed, grew, or perhaps faded away. The specific details were lost to history, but the story remained. It traveled from that one small village to other villages, from one generation to the next, changing slightly with each telling, but retaining its essential truth. And in remaining, it continued to do its work. It reminded people to open doors, to welcome strangers, to trust that hospitality would be rewarded, if not immediately, then eventually, if not materially, then spiritually. It taught that the new year enters through the doors we choose to open, that blessing often wears the face of the unknown, that what we most need sometimes arrives exactly when we least expect it. On New Year's Eve, even now, in places where the old traditions linger, some families still open their doors at midnight. The practice has largely been forgotten or dismissed as superstition, but in a few remote places, in a few families that remember, the ritual continues. They stand at the threshold as the clock strikes 12, they swing the door open to the cold night air, and they wait. Most times nothing comes, just wind and darkness and the distant sounds of celebration. But they keep the tradition anyway, because traditions are bridges between past and future, because ritual creates meaning even when nothing overtly miraculous occurs, because the act of opening itself matters regardless of what enters. And sometimes, very rarely, someone standing at an open door on New Year's Eve will see a figure in the distance, approaching through the snow. Sometimes they will find themselves inviting that figure inside, sharing warmth and food, keeping vigil through the long hours of darkness. And when morning comes and the stranger has vanished, they will find that the new year feels different somehow. Lighter, more full of possibility, as if something heavy was carried away in the night and something bright was left in its place. The door closes softly, the hearth glows warm, the family sleeps in peace, and the new year, having been properly welcomed, settles into the house like a long-expected guest who has finally arrived home. Outside, snow continues to fall, covering all tracks, erasing all evidence, returning the world to blankness and possibility. Inside, warmth endures. Life continues. Hope persists. This is how years begin, when they begin well. Not with noise and spectacle, but with quiet acts of trust. Not with certainty about what will come, but with willingness to welcome it when it arrives. Not by clinging to the old year, but by opening the door and allowing it to depart so the new one can enter. The threshold is the place of transformation. The door is the instrument of change. And hospitality is the key that unlocks blessing. So as another year ends and another begins, as we stand at our own thresholds, literal and metaphorical, may we remember this story. May we have the courage to open our doors even when the night is cold and the future is unknown. May we welcome the strangers who appear at our boundaries, for in welcoming them, we welcome possibilities we cannot yet imagine. May we trust that what we give will return to us, perhaps not in the form we expect, but in the form we need. May we keep vigil through the dark hours, tending the fire, watching and waiting, ready to receive whatever the new year brings. The door opens, the stranger enters, the blessing unfolds, and all is made new. Rest well, friend. The year has turned. The door stands ready, and whatever comes through it, may you greet it with an open heart and a welcoming spirit. For in the end, that is all any of us can do. Open the door, extend the hand, share the warmth, and trust that in doing so, we participate in mysteries larger and more beautiful than we can fully comprehend. The fire burns low but does not go out. The door is closed but not locked. And morning, faithful and certain, comes as it always does, bringing with it another day, another chance, another year full of doors waiting to be opened. Welcome the new year. Open the door, and may all your thresholds lead to blessing.